What if a forgotten stone in a museum basement could blow open one of history's biggest debates? In 1947, inside a pagan temple site in Egypt, researchers uncovered a weathered monument, a stela, a raised stone carved to memorialize events so rare and so consequential that rulers ordered them chiseled into rock. It wasn't a casual inscription or a scribble on papyrus. Stelas took time, skill, and official sanction. When you carve into granite, you intend your message to outlast empires. This particular stela, often called the Stela of Harmose, or simply the Egyptian Stela, left the archaeologist who read it stunned, because line after line sounded like an Egyptian eyewitness account of the very events the Bible describes: a land-ripping storm, a crippling darkness, and a catastrophe at the sea in which the king himself perished in a violent whirl. And in one razor-sharp detail, it even names the place the Bible calls Pi-Hahiroth, the stretch of shoreline where the waters opened and the Israelites crossed. To many, it reads less like myth and more like a dispatch from the ground. Let's set the scene. A stela isn't written by amateurs. You needed scribes who knew sacred signs, carvers who could score stone, and a political reason to do it. The Egyptians didn't raise a stele for the ordinary. They raised them for storms of destiny. And according to those who studied the text, this stone came out of the sands at precisely the right place and time. Egypt's own soil, bearing Egypt's own voice, describing events that shook Egypt to its core. First, the stela speaks of a vast and violent tempest, not a breeze, not a passing shower, but an elemental assault. Egypt is a desert kingdom, the land of cloudless skies and predictable suns. Storms that chew through cities and bend the horizon simply do not happen there, unless something is terribly out of balance. Yet the inscription describes savage winds, a deluge of rain, and a chaos that tore at the heart of the country. If you can, imagine Alexandria without the Mediterranean, scorching heat, dust, the kind of dry that cracks your lips by noon. Now imagine that same Egypt suddenly swallowed by a sky gone mad, gale force winds, rain slashing sideways, structures buckling, people shouting over a roar that drowns thought. The stela reads like a siren wail in stone. If you've read the Exodus account, you know it speaks of a colossal wind splitting the waters, of a night when the climate itself turned accomplice. The stela's storm isn't a gentle alignment, it's a clash. The kind of meteorological violence the biblical narrative insists was the hinge of escape. Is it coincidence or convergence? That's the question this stone forces you to ask. Then comes the darkness. The stela tells of a blackness so total that people could not see each other, a cosmic blindfold over an entire nation. Darkness in Egypt wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a theological crisis. Egyptians lived under the gaze of gods, the sun god, the sky goddess, divine eyes everywhere. But this stone says even the gods could not be seen. Their gaze, their power, seemed impotent. The eye of Ra dimmed. The household idols did nothing. The priests had no ritual for a sky that would not speak. In the biblical narrative, the penultimate plague is darkness, thick, immobilizing, crushing the daily order of life for 3 days. On the stone, you can hear the echo, fear, paralysis, people frozen in place, not daring to move through a world that had lost its light. The alignment is uncanny. And then, perhaps the most shocking line of all, a pharaoh named Harmose dies in the sea, swallowed in a kind of marine vortex. The inscription doesn't leave the end of the saga to imagination. It names the king and the fate, a violent death amid waters that turned against their pursuers. If you're hearing chariots striking wet stone, shouting soldiers splashed by spray, and the sudden thunder of closing water, you're hearing what both stories claim to recount. The last charge of Egypt's might as the sea, momentarily torn, heaved back and reclaimed its bed. The stela doesn't stop at fate. It sketches geography. It names a place the text calls Pi-Hahiroth, the eerily precise shoreline where Israel camped and where the waters opened, known in some translations as the Sea of Reeds. The inscription's claim is not subtle. It pins the location, pins the catastrophe, pins the king. For anyone who has ever said, this is all fable, this is borrowed myth, this is late invention, the stone simply stares back, and there's a final theological twist. The text insists that what happened was the work of one God, singular, not a quarrel of many deities, but a display of one unmatched power. Listen to that through Egyptian ears. Egypt was the empire of many gods, the empire of ritual and plurality. For an Egyptian text to speak of a single divine force overpowering the rest is like a courtroom confession. Our pantheon was helpless. Something else was at work. Strangely, this treasure, bearing details that electrify anyone who cares about the Exodus, has not been showcased in gleaming halls. Accounts say it sits in the storerooms of Cairo's museum, as if tucked away to quiet the noise. Whether that's bureaucracy, backlog, or discomfort with what it implies, the result is the same. The conversation drifts on while a carved witness waits in the dark. Before we go further, a quick thought experiment for you. If a single Egyptian inscription named the shoreline of Pi-Hahiroth and reported a pharaoh's death at sea, how would that change your view of the Exodus? I'd love to hear your take in the comments. And if deep dives into ancient texts, archaeology and faith light you up, tap like and subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. We turn data into stories and stones into voices. Now, skeptics often respond, fine, one stone can be misread. So let's bring in another witness, a voice on papyrus, fragile and furious with grief. The Ipuwer Papyrus. This isn't a Hebrew hymn or a later retelling. It's Egyptian literature, lamentation from within the house that suffered. Line for line, it reads like the inside-out version of Exodus, as if the camera moved from the Israelite camp to the Egyptian streets. Ipuwer begins with a shudder. There is a plague upon the land, and blood is everywhere. Rivers are red. Water cannot be drunk. People shrink from the cup, terrified. That is not symbolic language when your tongue is stuck to the roof of your mouth. If you know the first plague, the words are almost unbearable in their closeness. These aren't the phrases of later followers smoothing a story. This is the cry of a city whose wells have turned to dread. Then, livestock. The papyrus speaks of the animals suffering, of hearts grieving, of a plague upon the herds. The ancient Hebrew term for that livestock plague is diva, a word that lands like a weight. Read Ipuwer with that in mind, and you feel the shared vocabulary of catastrophe. Herders weep, fields fall silent. The wealth of a nation bends under invisible pressure. And then hail. The biblical account is specific. Hail with fire in it, a paradox of ice and flame that shattered the sky and split the land. On Ipuwer's sheet you can almost hear stone on stone. He describes a fall of stones that breaks walls and impossibly ignites fires. Hail should not burn, but when the miracle is both frost and fire, the city burns while it freezes. People run under a sky that throws arrows. Roofs split, courtyards flood and blaze. The papyrus reads like a report from a city hammered by the impossible. After the hail, hunger. Granaries slump into emptiness. People crowd the palace, hands out, eyes desperate. The fields, the very breadbasket of Egypt, look like they've been cut clean by an invisible scythe. And when a stalk or a fig remains, the locusts arrive, a living blanket that eats the color out of the world. Ipuwer writes that what remained yesterday is gone today. The land looks as if harvest came and left nothing. No fruit, no greens, only the sound of chewing and the quiet after. Darkness returns in his lines too, not the cool shade by the Nile, but a smothering absence of light. Doors stay barred, people do not move. The city becomes a chamber. And then, the scream. The biblical narrative says there was a great cry in Egypt on the night the firstborn fell. Ipuwer writes of a loud cry throughout the land, of lamentation and mourning, of a nation on its knees. The text imagines the unthinkable. Will anyone be born again? Is this the end of life in this place? It's not just losses, it's the dread that history itself has been cut. There is something else at the beginning of Ipuwer that grips the reader. He speaks of a people brought from elsewhere, swelling in number, then enslaved. If you've read Exodus, you know the prologue. Joseph, famine, migration, a small clan becoming a nation, a new king who does not remember, hard labor, harder decrees, the anxiety of rulers who fear the strength of those they oppress. And in Ipuwer, from the other side of the wall, you can feel the fear of the elite. The order is breaking, the margins are rising, the scripts don't work anymore. Now, are the papyrus and the Stela copies of the Hebrew Bible? No, they come from Egypt's own pens, not from desert tents. The Bible, by its own claim, was given amid the wilderness, long after Egypt's shock. The Egyptians did not have the scrolls of Moses to crib. That is precisely what makes the convergence so unsettling. Side by side, they read like two witnesses describing the same night from opposite ends of the street. Skeptics will say these are generic laments. The storm is just weather. The rivers were red from silt. The darkness a sandstorm, the hail a freak front. The locusts a seasonal swarm, the deaths a disease. But listen carefully. The Stela pins a king to a death in the sea. It names a shoreline. It speaks of a single god's decisive hand. The papyrus matches plague for plague. Details with details that should not match if this is merely random. You can file each line under coincidence, or you can let the pattern speak. And the pattern tells a story as old as faith and as sharp as today's questions. It tells of a God who broke the back of oppression in the language oppressors understood, nature itself. It tells of a people who walked between walls of water with fear and hope mixing in their throats. It tells of rulers who learned a hard lesson too late, pursuing freedom's children into a sea that would not bear them. It tells of an empire with many gods meeting a presence that did not share power. So here we are holding two artifacts, a carved stone that remembers a storm, a darkness, a king lost in a whirl at the sea, and a papyrus that weeps through blood-red water, burning hail, empty fields, a sky blotted by locusts, a night broken by the cry of the firstborn. You don't need to force them into belief. You just need to read them aloud and listen to how they answer each other. Does this prove the Exodus in the way a modern courtroom demands? Proof is a modern word for an ancient world. But what these artifacts give us is weight, texture, and the stubborn testimony of Egypt itself. The Bible says God did these things so that all would know who He is. The stone and the papyrus, from the very house that suffered, seem to nod in our direction and say, "We remember." Whether you approach as a believer, a skeptic, or simply a lover of history, the invitation is the same. Follow the evidence and let the voices of the past speak for themselves. If this resonated with you, share it with someone who's wrestled with these questions. And if you want more deep, careful storytelling from the crossroads of archaeology and faith, you know what to do. Hit subscribe, turn on the bell, and let's keep turning stones into stories together.